In the spring of 1673, a 31-year-old Sudbury native called Ephraim Curtis departed from his family's house armed with a felling axe and a long Spanish musket, and set off down the Western Road to Marlborough. Perhaps, as he made his way out of town, he passed the meeting house and the town cemetery, where Peter Noyes, Walter Haynes and Edmund Rice were now mouldering in their graves. Curtis crossed Town Bridge. If by chance he looked up during that moment, then he saw the Haynes family house, an impressive 2-storey structure overlooking the river. It was just across the meadow where dry land rose from the floodplain a little less than half a mile distant. After Walter's death, the house had been inherited by his son John. Today, only the ruins of the cellar remain. Curtis then turned south, away from the newly constructed Lancaster Road and down a cart path corresponding closely to modern-day River Road. Here he passed the new homestead of the Goodenow clan. Edmund and Anne had come a long way from their dank earthen shelter by the cemetery, and this new farmhouse on the west side of the river was spacious and luxurious, as befitted one of the town's leading families. The house stood at the base of Green Hill for 200 years, before it was demolished in the 19th century. It is now the site of the Buddy Dog Humane Society, a local non-profit animal welfare organisation. A mile further down the road, Curtis must have spied the Hopbrook Mill to his left, the construction of which had been Thomas Noyes' personal project. And then, the press of trees would have grown thicker, the path narrower, as he entered the forests on the outskirts of town. Marlborough would have been the last bastion of European civilization Curtis came across before he plunged into the wilderness of Nipmuc country, which to his English eyes must have seemed inscrutable and frightening. There were no roads out here, only ancient indigenous footpaths. He spent at least one night camped alone in the howling dark of these forbidding woods, which, according to the religious beliefs that had been hammered into him since infancy, was the domain of Satan and his demonic licentious children, the so-called savage Indians. But where many Puritans saw danger, Curtis saw opportunity. He was a young man, part of the generation of colonists who had never seen England. Curtis was a Massachusetts Bay man born and raised. Frontier life was the only life he knew. The vision of a godly utopia, that shining city on a hill, was his father's dream, not his. 20 years before, men like John Ruddock had rejected the collectivist foundations of colonial Puritan life in favour of individual prosperity and economic competition. Now, men like Ephraim Curtis would finish the process that Ruddock and his ilk had started. After a 2-day journey, he arrived at the Nipmuc village of Quinsigamond, the location of modern-day Worcester, and immediately set up a trading post. He would later attempt to claim 500 acres of the surrounding land as his own, though the colonial government only ended up granting him 50. Demonic or not, there was money to be made in these dark forests, and Curtis would be damned if he let someone else corner the market in Quinsigamond first. Puritans in the former half of the 17th century emphasised the common in Commonwealth. For Puritans of the latter half, it was all about the wealth. Old guard clergymen such as Increase Mather were well known for castigating this rising generation for their lack of faith. But importantly, they also singled out greedy and land-hungry frontiersmen like Curtis as particularly egregious fonts of spiritual corruption. As Mather wrote in 1676,
whereas the first planters were satisfied with 1 acre for each person as his propriety, and after that with 20 acres for a family, how have men since coveted after the age that many hundreds, nay thousands of acres have been engrossed by one man, and they that profess themselves Christians have forsaken churches and ordinances, and all for land and elbow room.
But by the time Curtis went out to ply his wares among the Nipmuc were already thoroughly entangled in the transatlantic economy. They now wore as much linen and wool as they did animal skin. Steel tools and weapons had almost completely replaced those made from stone, bone or wood. Nipmuc hunters and warriors were proficient in musketry and possessed all the latest firearm technology. Since European trade goods had become widely available in the 1630s, the Nipmuc way of life had been completely transformed. The only thing the English wanted in exchange for these incredible goods was fur from the common beaver. Europe had long since effectively exterminated its own wild fur-bearing animals, creating a huge demand for pelts from North America. As the Nipmuc became increasingly dependent on English trade goods, they spent less time maintaining their traditional lifeways and more time tracking down and killing beavers by the thousands to satisfy never-ending European demand. The fur trade in the Nipmuc homelands reached its apex in the 1640s, then began to gradually decline as hunters killed beavers faster than the animals could reproduce and replenish their numbers. By the 1670s, the once abundant beavers of Dawnland had been hunted to local near extinction. Their population in the region has never recovered. However, it was not reckless greed that brought the Nipmuc to this bloody pass. It was a desperate race for national survival. It was abundantly clear to every native nation of Dawnland that access to European technology equated to political power in this strange new post-epidemic world. Participating in the transatlantic economy wasn't advantageous to the Nipmuc so much as it was essential to retaining their sovereignty. If they didn't provide a steady stream of fur to the English, then competing nations would, and the Nipmuc would find themselves literally outgunned by their enemies. Though the epidemics of the 1610s did not impact the Nipmuc as severely as it did coastal nations, the influx of trade goods brought another devastating disease: alcoholism. Indigenous people had no concept of social drinking. When they drank, it was with the goal to become as thoroughly intoxicated as possible, which made them easy prey for alcohol's addictive effects. To their credit, the government of Massachusetts Bay repeatedly attempted to outlaw, regulate, or otherwise curtail the sale of liquor to Native Americans, but such laws were impossible to enforce in the woods of Nipmuc country, miles from any court or magistrate. We do not know what precise goods Ephraim Curtis sold to the people of Quinsigamond, but there is a high probability that illegal alcohol was among them. Unscrupulous English fur traders were all too happy to sell beer, cider, wine and liquor to Nipmuc hunters, even those with crippling addictions. An addict will do anything to get their fix, and indigenous cultural prescriptions for ecological balance are quickly forgotten when that next bottle of rum is only 10 dead beavers away. Furthermore, when English merchants met native hunters to trade, the English would often intentionally ply the natives with alcohol. A common tactic was to open negotiations with a friendly drink. After they'd imbibed a couple big cups of strong brandy, Nipmuc hunters were much easier to take advantage of. It's hard to overstate the destruction alcoholism wreaked on the very fabric of social life in the Nipmuc nation. Cultural events like powwows, hunting ceremonies, trading conventions devolved into days-long bacchanalian binges. What had been family-friendly festivities now took on the nasty air of a late night on Bourbon Street, replete with shootings, stabbings and robberies. Alcohol ruined lives and tore families apart, and the unspeakable heartbreak of loved ones lost to addiction drew the Nipmuc nation closer and closer to the brink. The transformative effects of another English import, Christianity, were also becoming impossible to ignore. The period between 1670 and 1674 saw an unprecedented flurry of increased missionary activity, with several praying Indian towns springing up all across Nipmuc country. From these regional bases of operation, evangelists like John Eliot drew in indigenous congregants with the explicit goal of converting them to godly Protestantism. But sincere faith was not enough. Once converted, praying Indians were also required to forsake their culture and live as the English did. They abandoned their nomadic existences and moved into permanent towns. They took up work on enclosed farms, raising cows or pigs. They cut their hair, they wore the coarse, tight-fitting clothes of the English, and they were placed under the legal authority of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Christianity was extremely controversial among the Nipmuc. Though many were receptive to the new faith, including some sachems, the missionaries were met with fierce resistance from a sizable portion of the population, who deeply resented Christianity and the presumptuous cultural change that came with it. Furthermore, the missionaries in their midst had repeatedly done all they could to influence the course of Nipmuc politics. When Sholin, the sachem of the Nashaway band of Nipmuc, had passed away in 1654, his succession was contested between two men: Sholin's nephew, who had the Christian name Matthew, a praying Indian well disposed to English interests, and another unnamed relative, probably the war leader Shoshannon, who was openly hostile to all things European. Eliot personally intervened in the tribal council's deliberations on the succession, which tipped the vote in Matthew's favour. The minister's meddling must have rankled the anti-Christian factions in all four bands of the Nipmuc nation. But the Puritans would not realise quite how much these Nipmuc hated them until it was much too late. For decades, conversion to the English religion and way of life had been strictly voluntary. But in the early 1670s, Massachusetts Bay officials crisscrossed Nipmuc country, announcing to anyone that would listen that their nation was under the legal authority of the colonial government, effective immediately. Their receipt for this draconian measure was a pledge of allegiance some Nipmuc sachems had made back in the 1640s. Like the Sudbury land deeds, the full import of these, quote, submissions had been misunderstood at the time. The sachems had believed they were agreeing to ally exclusively with the English rather than a competing European power, not submitting to them. Outrageously, under this new policy, the Nipmuc could only legally retain ownership of their millennia-old ancestral homelands by submitting a request for a land grant to the General Court. As Daniel Gookin, Boston's representative to the Nipmuc, explained,
"It is necessary for the Indians, as the case stands, for their present and future security and tranquillity, to receive the lands by grant from the English, who are a growing and important people, comparatively to the Indians."
In practical terms, this meant that the Nipmuc would either have to become praying Indians and live under English authority, or else be evicted from their ancestral lands and confined to government-approved reservations. The ancient Nipmuc nation, beset on all sides by economic, social, cultural and spiritual threats, now came face to face with the immediate prospect of political annihilation and unconditional subjugation under the yoke of a foreign power. The embers of violent resistance had been simmering among the Nipmuc for years, and through its own hard-hand diplomacy, Massachusetts Bay had just poured gasoline onto the fire. King Philip's War was coming to New England, and the wrathful Nipmuc would soon roll over the Massachusetts frontier like a terrible storm. In the war's darkest, most desperate days in the spring of 1676, councilmen in Boston would send this hurried note to the governor of Plymouth Colony.
Honoured Sir, since our last to you, it pleaseth the Holy God to give still further success to the enemy in this colony. This day we have intelligence in the general that Sudbury was this morning assaulted, and many houses burnt down.
In late June 1675, Wampanoag warriors led by Metacomet, alias King Philip, sachem of the Poconoket, destroyed the town of Swansea in Plymouth Colony. After decades of acrimony and exploitation, the dam had finally broken. An indigenous nation and an English colony were now in a state of open warfare. As Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay militia swooped down upon the Wampanoag homelands to exact their revenge, frontier towns like Sudbury were gripped by a sickening dread. The Nipmuc had every reason to pick up their guns and join the Wampanoag, and the government of Massachusetts Bay knew it. So the governor and the council of the colony enlisted Ephraim Curtis to ascertain the Nipmuc's intentions and, if possible, secure a promise of fidelity. Bearing a declaration of peace under a public seal, Curtis again travelled west in July 1675, accompanied by 3 praying Indians from Natick. Arriving in Marlborough, Curtis approached the walled praying Indian settlement which adjoined the town, where he received ominous news. His trading post at Quinsigamond had been destroyed. To prove it, the converts showed him some of his goods, which they had apparently recovered from the wreckage. They warned the diplomats that the Nipmuc had already joined with the Wampanoag, and that they were almost certainly going to their deaths, as Curtis explained in his report to the colonial government.
They told me it was very dangerous for me to go into the woods, for that the sachem Matunas, which they said was the leader of them that robbed me out, was in company of 15 men and met accomplices, and they might happen to mate me. And if I missed him, yet it was dangerous to mate or say the other Nipmuc Indians which were gathered together, for they would be ready to shoot me as soon as they saw me. With news, those 3 Natick Indians which were with me as volunteers were discouraged, and told me that if I did not provide more company, they were not willing to go with me.
Curtis obliged his companions, and asked the Constable of Marlborough to grant him additional men, horses and muskets. Once in Nipmuc country, they encountered yet more portentous signs. Every village they came across was abandoned. After a lengthy search, during which they hadn't seen a soul, the diplomats happened upon 2 natives by chance, who immediately fled from them. Curtis chased one of them down on horseback and demanded to know where the Nipmucs had gone. The terrified man stammered out that the sachems had gathered their people atop a secret meeting place nearby, a steep hill surrounded by a natural moat of swamps and rivers. Coming to the waters encircling this forest hold fast, Curtis's party was stopped by 40 armed Nipmuc warriors, their muskets loaded and primed. Curtis announced that he had come to speak to the sachems of their nation, and bore a message of peace from the governor of Massachusetts. Then, as Curtis wrote,
there was a very great uproar amongst them. Some of them would have had me and my company presently killed, but many others, as I understood afterwards, were against it. I required their sachems to come over the river, but they refused, saying that I must come over to them. My company were something unwilling, for they thought themselves in very great danger where we were. They said, what shall we be when we are o'er the river, amongst all the vile rout? I told them we had better never have seen them, than not to speak with their sachems, and if we run from them in the time of this tumult, they would shout after us. and kill some of us.
In a heart-stopping gamble that could easily have cost the entire party their lives, Curtis forded the river and pushed his way past the shouting warriors. Despite the fact that they had him at gunpoint, he climbed the hill to where the sachems were encamped and barged his way into their meeting. Curtis's entrance threw the entire Nipmuc assembly into chaos. Some of the sachems demanded that the diplomats be killed at once. Others urged caution, and a screaming match ensued. Finally, with, quote, much threatening and persuasion, the warriors put up their guns and Curtis was allowed to make his case. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. By this time, Mutawamp, the staunchly anti-English sachem of the Quabog, had achieved ascendancy over the leaders of the other bands. There would be no peace. Unbeknownst to Curtis, the war in Massachusetts Bay had already begun. At the same time that he was attempting to treat with Mutawamp, Matunus and his warriors raided the town of Mendon and murdered several of its inhabitants. News of the massacre swept across the frontier like wildfire. The Nipmuc were out for blood, and the people of Sudbury knew that an attack could come at any time. So the town came together to see to its own defence. There was no military fort within town limits. If and when Indigenous forces attacked, the townspeople were to flee to one of a number of buttressed private homes referred to as garrison houses, the walls of which were often lined with brick to protect against gunfire. The people of Sudbury spent the rest of 1675 fortifying their garrison houses as well as other homes and barns, as though preparing for the landfall of a fearsome hurricane. Edmund Brown, now in his early 70s and still town minister, turned his homestead at Timberneck into a garrison house. Though he made impressive progress on the work for a man of advancing years, in September he wrote to the governor of Massachusetts Bay asking for additional hands. It may be a reflection of his poor standing in the community, or simply his well-recorded personal pride, that he asked the government rather than his neighbours for help. On the west side of the river, the Goodenow and Haynes families also shored up their homes into formidable fortresses. That summer and autumn, the war raged hottest in the Connecticut River Valley, west of Nipmuc country, where English forces were faced with defeat at every turn. This disconcerting news must have made the work of fortification even more frantic and urgent. Anxiety in Sudbury must have run high, as political issues that once seemed so distant and unimportant now threatened to burst through their front doors, hooting and hollering, an axe in one hand and a ball club in the other. Autumn turned to winter, and anxiety turned to outright panic when hostile Native Americans began to be spotted in the woods around the town, especially at night. In another letter to the Massachusetts government, Reverend Brown reported that
our woods are pestered with Indians. One Adams within our bounds was shot at by a Larkin Indian or Mar. He was shot through the coat and shirt near to the armpit. One Smith Walk in the woods was assailed by 3 or 4 Indians, whom he discovered swooping down a hill toward him, but Smith saved himself by his legs. One Joseph Freeman, coming up about 4 Mile Brook, discovered 2 Indians, one in the path, presenting his gun at him in the way in a bright moonlight night. But Freeman, dismounting, shot at him, and mounting, rode for it. One Joseph Chalet, coming home from Marlborough on Thursday last, discovered Indians in our bounds, one of which made a shot at him, the bullet passing by him, but being mounted and riding for it, he escaped. One Joseph Curtis, son to Ephraim Curtis, on Saturday last, heard 3 volleys a shot made by Indians between us and Weston. The consideration of all which I hope will excite you, to order that these woods may be scoured, and that our town of Sudbury, a frontier town, may be enabled to contribute aid therein, and defend itself with its quantity of men I humbly move.
As frightening as these encounters were, in 1675 they remained isolated incidents. But in January 1676, the English received intelligence from preying Indian spies that the Nipmuc were planning a major offensive into Middlesex County to retake their eastern homelands by fire and sword. Hundreds of Indigenous warriors and their families began moving into the area in preparation for the assault. Among them were former residents of the Muskedequid Valley, who, befitting Algonquian wartime custom, had come to wreak personal revenge against individual English men and women who they felt had wronged them. This was almost certainly the case with Nettus, the praying Indian who had been sued by a Sudbury settler for reneging on a debt. Sometime in the 20 years since, he had apostatised from Christianity, and with the outbreak of King Philip's War, took up arms against the English, entering Mutterwamp's service as a war leader. On February the 1st or 2nd, Nettus led about a dozen native warriors to the isolated farmhouse of Thomas Eames on the outskirts of Sudbury. The Eames family had been Nettus's neighbours for decades. It's unknown why he targeted Eames specifically, but it's highly likely that the war leader felt the farmer had slighted him in some way. Perhaps the two men had always hated each other. Whatever the case may be, when Nettus's warband swooped in for the attack, they found Eames himself was not at home, so they contented themselves with terrorising his family. According to one possibly apocryphal account, Eames's wife was rendering tallow for soap at the time of the raid, and managed to disfigure a few Indigenous warriors by throwing boiling fat on them before they were finally able to cut her down. After which, Nettus either murdered or took captive her 9 children. The warriors set fire to Eames's house and barn, slaughtered his cows, and melted back into the forest before anyone else in Sudbury knew what was happening. On February the 9th, the Indigenous offensive began in earnest with a brutal attack on Lancaster, Massachusetts, 15 miles northwest of Sudbury, a raid so destructive that it led to the temporary abandonment of the town. Somewhat belatedly, the government of Massachusetts Bay began to take drastic action to reinforce the frontier. Marlborough was established as a base of military operations, receiving copious shipments of food, supplies, guns and ammunition. Captain Samuel Mosley was ordered to bring his notorious company of cutthroats and pirates to reinforce Sudbury. As colonial troops were typically quartered in the outbuildings of private homes, this must have been an extremely unpleasant time for several local families, as they were forced to house the most infamously bloodthirsty soldiers of the entire war. On February the 21st, Nipmuc forces attacked and burned nearby Medfield, 15 miles to the south. As the local militia tried to chase the marauders out of town, they found a note, written in English, affixed to the ruins of a destroyed bridge.
Know by this paper, that the Indians that thou hast provoked to wrath and anger will war this 21 years, if ye will. There are many Indians yet. We come 300 at this time. You must consider the Indians lost nothing but their life. You must lose your fair houses and cattle.
On March the 13th, the Nipmuc rampaged freely through Grattan to the north, burning the meeting house and most of the town as the populace cowered in their garrison houses. 2 days later, a pair of Englishmen travelling from Marlborough to Sudbury were ambushed by a group of native women who beat their brains out with clubs and castrated their corpses with shards of old metal. On March the 26th, native forces launched a major raid on Marlborough itself. It was a Sunday morning when militiamen and civilians alike were attending services in the meeting house. Tradition has it that the English only realised the town was on fire when the minister, suffering from an acute toothache, took a moment to step outside. Once the damage had been done and the Nipmuc had retreated, the militia promptly evacuated all the civilians of Marlborough, and the town was maintained purely as a military outpost under the command of Captain Samuel Brocklebank. Later that same day, terrifying reports flooded into Sudbury that the same force of Nipmuc warriors, some 300 strong, was now closing in on their western outskirts. Ephraim Curtis, never one to flee from danger, hastily organised a counterattack. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 27th, Curtis and 20 civilian volunteers, together with a group of Marlborough militiamen of about the same number, discovered a large camp of sleeping native warriors just outside town. They gingerly surrounded the camp and, probably at a preordained signal, let loose several volleys of musket fire. Taken completely by surprise, and likely having no idea how few Englishmen actually stood against them, the indigenous forces scattered into the woods. Walking among the dead and wounded, Curtis's men discovered the body of Nettus, who had been killed outright by a hail of lead. But this decisive victory did not prevent an all-out attack, it merely postponed it. Over the next 3 weeks, the thickest action of the war moved south as the Narragansett tore their way through their ancestral homelands in Rhode Island, avenging themselves for the unprovoked English massacre of several hundred of their people in the Great Swamp Fight the previous December. But the Nipmuc did not forget their humiliation at the hands of Curtis and the people of Sudbury. By April the 19th, an immense force of about 500 warriors had gathered on the sacred peak of Mount Wachusett. Though primarily Nipmuc, all the major nations of the Native Alliance were probably represented. According to Englishwoman Mary Rowlandson, who had been taken captive during the raid on Lancaster, they held a powwow where a sachem or war leader delivered 2 electrifying speeches to the warriors, holding a musket in each hand. In response, the warriors sang, shouted and hummed, banging the ground with sticks and fists. Then they streamed out of the camp, armed to the teeth, bound for Sudbury. April the 21st, 1676, probably began much like any other spring day in Sudbury. It was a clear and, according to one account, windy day. As the sun rose, the town began to stir, and households filled with the growing murmur of early morning chores. If a dog barked and snarled at the tree line in the misty gloom of dawn, no one took notice. Suddenly, musket fire rang out. Then, the ghostly echo of distant war cries. The people of Sudbury knew exactly what those sounds meant, and terror doubtlessly swept over them like a cold sweat. But they had prepared for 10 months for this moment, and knew exactly what to do. The townspeople dropped everything, abandoned their homes, and made for whichever garrison house was closest. In those first few minutes, it's likely that very few villagers actually saw indigenous raiders, but everyone could hear them. The war cries must have been loudest on the west side of the river. There were hundreds of voices in that warlike chorus, but to the fleeing townspeople it must have seemed like thousands. It's little wonder that later English accounts exaggerated the count of native combatants at this battle to 2 or 3 times their likeliest number. On the west bank, residents scurried into either the Haynes or Goodnow garrison houses. Smoke from burning houses and barns was probably starting to darken the horizon. Perhaps, under the war cries, the refugees could also hear the agonised screams of their own cows and pigs as they were hacked to pieces in their pens, farm animals being a hated symbol of the English hunger for land, targeted again and again by native forces throughout King Philip's War. Almost immediately, the Haynes garrison house began to take heavy fire from indigenous musketeers positioned on a hill to the rear of the house, at level with the fortified second storey, allowing the warriors to shoot directly into the windows from behind the cover of trees and rocks. But the Haynes garrison proved a hard nut to crack. Well supplied with shot and powder, the men of the garrison coolly picked off a number of their assailants, while suffering no recorded casualties themselves. As several eminent citizens of Sudbury later recounted,
the enemy with great force and fury assaulted Deacon Ains's house, well fortified yet badly situated, as advantageous to the enemy's approach as dangerous to the repellent. Yet, by the help of God, the garrison not only defended the place from between 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning till about 1 in the afternoon, but forced the enemy, with considerable slaughter, to draw off.
Despite the fact that Sudbury had sounded its alarm, probably an ear-splitting cannon shot in the general direction of a nearby English settlement, the militia was naught to be found all morning. For now, the only relief on hand was a paltry 12-man detachment of civilian volunteers from Concord. The defenders of the Haynes garrison could probably see them approach down the northern road just across the river. But as they peered east, the defenders would have been presented by a very strange sight. A group of native women appeared on the road ahead of the Concord men, dancing and shouting. When the Concord men pursued, the women ran away, and a stomach-churning number of armed warriors emerged from the tall grasses to envelop and butcher the would-be rescuers. The skirmish was over before it could begin. After killing most of the Concord men, the warriors unceremoniously dumped their corpses in the boggy waters of the river meadow. Fortunately for Sudbury, more help was coming. As their native besiegers finally retreated in the early afternoon, those at the Haynes garrison would have heard the crackle of musketry erupt both to the east and west, as militia companies from Watertown and Marlborough converged on the town. A few minutes later, there would have been a chorus of blood-curdling war cries to the west, 100 throats opening all at once, and then the shouts, screams and clamour of hand-to-hand combat. Though the townspeople at the Haynes garrison did not yet know it, the company of Captain Samuel Wadsworth, accompanied by the Marlborough militia of Samuel Brocklebank, had just been encircled by a deadly Nipmuc ambuscade. Captain Wadsworth's men fought their way up this hill in the hope that some high ground would bring safety. Here, at its summit, they made their stand. Facing native charges from all sides, Wadsworth ordered his men to form a square. They were outnumbered by possibly as much as 5 to 1, but nonetheless survived against impossible odds for 4 desperate hours. Wadsworth's men were physically exhausted, but the native forces arrayed against them were starving. Mary Rowlandson's account tells us that despite their military successes, the situation on the Indigenous home front was bleak in the spring of 1676. The beleaguered armies threw themselves at one another again and again. Finally, as nightfall approached, native warriors set the dry leaves and grasses of the hill on fire. Wind fanned the flames, choking Wadsworth's company with smoke, and at last they broke and ran, stumbling down this slope and into this gully, where native warriors quickly dispatched more than half of them, war clubs and hatchets rising and falling, cutting screams short. With that, Indigenous forces pulled back to the west, leaving a smouldering and grief-stricken town in its wake. The villagers remained in their garrison houses that night and most of the next morning, until a company of praying Indians, under the command of Captain Samuel Hunting, disguised themselves by removing their European clothing and putting on war paint, and reconnoitred the woods on the west side of the river, confirming that the native raiders had indeed departed. This company, together with some survivors from the English militia, then went to the base of Green Hill to bury Captain Wadsworth and his men. The Indigenous army, meanwhile, stopped in Marlborough that morning, where they burned deserted buildings, drove away cows, and taunted the few militiamen still stationed there, who watched the destruction from behind their palisades. The warriors headed back to their base at Mount Wachusett the following day. Despite their gloating in Marlborough, the Indigenous homecoming was sombre and sullen. As eyewitness Mary Rowlandson explained,
They came home without that rejoicing and triumphing over their victory which they were wont to show at other times, but rather like dogs, as they say, which have lost their ears. When they went, they acted as if the devil had told them that they should gain the victory, and now they acted as if the devil had told them they should have a fall. Whether it were so or no, I cannot tell, but so it proved, for quickly they began to fall, and so held on that summer, till they came to utter ruin.
Though only 2 townspeople lost their lives in this battle, the Sudbury fight, as it became known, native warriors destroyed nearly £3,000 worth of property, equal to more than $700,000 in today's money. The economy and infrastructure of the town didn't fully recover for at least 2 years. Relations between the English colonists of Sudbury and the indigenous people of Muskedequid would never be the same. Though the honourable conduct Captain Hunting's praying Indians displayed in the burial of the English dead softened some colonist bigotry towards natives, New England as a whole became a bitterly intolerant place for indigenous people in the wake of King Philip's War. Since the non-Christian natives of Dawnland were now largely dead, enslaved in the Caribbean or fleeing the region as refugees, the only indigenous people left to absorb English hatred were the praying Indians, most of whom had been nothing but loyal to them. This thirst for revenge cost at least 2 innocent local praying Indians their lives. Tantamouse, the old man nicknamed Jethro, was among those indigenous Christians forcibly detained in an internment camp on Deer Island in Boston Harbour. He escaped bondage only to be betrayed by his own son, captured and hanged. Multiple English witnesses claim to have seen the praying Indian Watasakomponum on the battlefield at Green Hill, fighting with the enemy, a charge he vehemently denied right up until the moment they pushed him off the scaffold. Edmund Brown probably spoke for most in Sudbury when he advocated for the, quote, diminishing of the surviving native population, in this telling letter to the magistrates of the county.
Indians are generally treacherous. To that diminishing of their number, this may be done 2 ways. First, by the sword of coercive justice, cutting those off by death that have apparently and very unjustly imbued their hands in the blood of the English. The second way of diminishing them is by transporting some others into transmarine parts. It was by some judged a politic curse to send the Scots taken at war far into transmarine parts. And are our renegade Indians objects of more favour than the Scots? No, their desert of punishment I conceive to be higher. Tragically,
that desert of punishment would never heal Massachusetts Bay's collective trauma from King Philip's War. Metacomet's head was rotting atop a pole overlooking Plymouth Harbour, but his ghost would haunt New Englanders for generations. Though Metacomet played a deceptively small part in the conflict that bears his English alias, the phantasmagorical legacy of King Philip would transform him into a mythological evil, a bogeyman to scare children, New England's ultimate nemesis. In the early 19th century, sectional contention between the northern and southern halves of the United States led to the development of 2 opposing national mythologies. And as the northern states shaped their history into a cultural narrative, the Sudbury fight was exalted as a defining moment in the inception of America. In 1903, Canadian-American author Wallace Rice, a direct descendant of Edmund Rice, reflected these ideas in a commemorative poem telling the story of the battle. Rice rewrote history to turn the chaotic English defeat into a hard-won victory, where the future of the American colonies was single-handedly decided. Additionally, King Philip is painted as the main villain of the piece, despite the fact that he was likely not even present for the battle. Reflecting the prevailing white supremacist norms of his time, Rice emphasised racialist imagery in his depiction of the native foe, describing Metacomet and his indigenous warriors with satanic and animalistic language.
100 dragging 12 months ere the welcome joy bells ring, the dawn of independence, did King Philip's devils spring through April on the little town like wolves a-ravening. The morning lifts in fury as they come with torch in hand, and howl about the houses in the little frontier town. Our garrisons hold steady while the flames by breezes fanned disclose the painted demons, fierce and cunning, lithe and brown.
Despite Rice's mythologizing, there is a deeper truth in his poem about how the people of Sudbury came to remember this defining experience. Edmund Goodnow, by 1676 a grizzled militia captain, survived the Sudbury fight, as did John and Josiah Haynes and everyone in the Noyes clan. All three families would remain in Sudbury for centuries and played key roles in every epoch of its history. Successfully defending their homes from a violent invader bound them to the land much more permanently than any legal document ever could. Like all dynasties, their right to rule was forged in blood. Though he too had lived to tell the tale, Reverend Brown's days were numbered. Shortly after King Philip's War, he contracted a severe and lengthy illness, which would kill him in June 1678. The passing of Sudbury's first minister marked the end of an era. The town fathers were all dead or dying. The only original settlers left were the ageing children of the Confidants, most of whom probably had no memory of England. Sudbury was shedding its initial identity as a far-flung English outpost and blossoming into a distinctly American town. The North American wilderness, once so mythic and exotic, was now home, and the indigenous heathens, a symbol of the devil's dominion of these strange shores, had for the most part been exterminated or expelled. The town would never again face an existential threat. The frontier expanded north and west, leaving Sudbury behind. Soon, the French in Canada and the Wabanaki in Maine would take the place of the Wampanoag and Nipmuc as New England's bitterest enemies. And after that, the British Crown. American Puritanism limped on for another generation before collapsing under the weight of the debacle of the Salem witch trials. Following that tragic injustice, the witch hunter Reverend Samuel Parris would retire in disgrace to Sudbury, where he died and was buried. In 1692, witchcraft hysteria became culturally indelible, and New Englanders soon began to regard their Puritan roots as something of an embarrassment. But not every aspect of the Puritan movement was destructive. There is an ideological through line in Massachusetts originating in the Puritan push for democratic egalitarianism, stretching to the 18th century Enlightenment philosophers, 19th century abolitionists, and the 20th and 21st century human rights activists. In terms of the arc of history, it is quite fitting that the oldest surviving meeting houses in Wayland and Sudbury are now Unitarian Universalist churches, though the Puritans themselves would doubtless be horrified by it. In his definitive history of the town of Sudbury, 19th century author Alfred Sereno Hudson waxed poetic about the displacement of the Musketequid native people, musing that
the last family hereabouts has long since disappeared. Their name is unspoken, and their very graves are unknown. They have been gathered to their fathers, with little to tell the stranger where once they dwelt. The streams still sparkle, but not for them. The hills are crowned with our corn. In the valley our gardens smile. Our grain makes yellow the plain. The town's natural outlook in a measure remains unchanged. But a race has vanished, and the customs, language, and life of another race is here.
The same could easily be said now about the Puritans who founded this town. We may not have many reasons to honour them, But let us not forget them. These were human beings after all, and we have more in common with them than we might think. By telling the stories of those who came before, we can celebrate their humanity, learn from their mistakes, and build a better future.